Not just out of religious ground, but because this is the nature of man, I think, for him.
Yes, I agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni Sartor. You just ended and gave with a perfect passage to Luciano Floridi, who, as you know all, is a professor, a philosopher. He teaches at Oxford University and Alan Turing Institute in London, and he will be talking about God. So let's ask him to start right on time his lesson, please.
Thank you. So the microphone seems to be working, and I suspect you may not. It's been a long day, and certainly it's been a long day for me. It must have been an awfully long day for you. So the topic is definitely not one you want to end a day with. Talking about God, the existence of God, it doesn't get any more boring than that. In order to make it just a touch less boring, I will try to attract your attention to a few points made by poor Leibniz. Some of them are very obvious, some of them are much more controversial. But before that, a premise. Imagine you're back in high school for a moment. I know it's a bit of a nightmare, but just imagine that for a moment. And all the disciplines you covered in high school. It could be geography, physics, Latin, Greek, the whole list. And then imagine dividing them between two different groups. And it's an oversimplification. The ones that describe the world, and we have a Greek word for that, they are mimetic. They just imagine that's not the case, but they take photocopies of the world. And that is physics, for example, or chemistry, or biology. An oversimplification these days. And then there are other disciplines which actually build the world that they study. And it's law, economics, for some people, mathematics, engineering, architecture, and sometimes philosophy. So for people like you who are in the poetic area of knowledge, the area that builds its own topic, surely the question becomes, well, if I build my own topic, how do I build it? How do I construct my own area? Well, the only thing that we have, philosophers and lawyers, are words. That's what we build our discipline with. In fact, actually, if you look at computer science, the other great discipline that builds its own topic, those are, in a way, words anyway. No, it's language. So all we have to build is language. Now, language, back to today, forget about the nightmare of high school. So this division between the mimetic and the poetic, and of course you can mix and match at some point, but it's a good distinction to say, what are the disciplines that count today, in the 21st century? Surely we left behind the disciplines that describe the world, because the ones that you think today, outside this room, for a moment, and you think, what are the coolest things, what are really making a difference to my world? And you know that they are computer science, economics, and law. These are the three forces that are changing the world as we know it, and they are all on that divide. They are poetic disciplines. So what about philosophy? Can philosophy be poetic? Well, what we're going to do today is to see whether philosophy can use language to build something. But before that, and with apology to the non-Italian speakers in the room, I think I want to introduce a classic analysis of what it means to build with words. Basically, perhaps the most important statement that we have had for a long time about what it means to know what you're doing with words. And we don't have the audio, of course. So in this particular context, where the audio is not to be found around here, what you know here is Nanni Moretti telling to the journalist how important it is to have a careful attitude towards words. She's using words in a very generic way. She's being uncareful, in fact, rather misleading about the words in general. And as a result, I'll tell you the story anyway, because I hope you have seen this particular scene. He gets very upset. We'll let it run in the background. If you haven't seen the movie, please do. And this is a beautiful statement where at some point he says that words, they matter, they make a difference. You can't be so sloppy. You can't pile up words after words. Look, now he's feeling sick because, of course, she's using trivial statements, insisting on the use of a vocabulary that has been betraying the meaning of what he wants to say. So it becomes violent at some point, but let me move forward because I was hoping that you would hear the actual Italian, which is beautiful, and I strongly recommend you to YouTube that, perhaps now if you get too bored. So how did we ever got there? How we transform philosophy into a discipline that makes things with words? Well, a long, long time ago, someone called Anselm, which I think you might have encountered in high school, in 1077, wrote a book called Proslogion. In that, he tried to prove the existence of God. Just that, by using only words, or reasoning conveyed by words. Out of thin air. You know the rabbit out of the hat? Well, that is what he's trying to do. But he really means to get the hat and the rabbit interact with each other. So he means to do something with words that will transform a problem into a solution by building the concept with those words. Well, something happened much later in 1981. I was 17, and I read about Anselm, and I loved Kant, and I was a little school boy. And those were two of my heroes, but they disagree on this. Anselm says you can prove the existence of God by using an argument, and Kant says you must be an idiot. And one of the two must be right. But I love both. So I started talking and checking. Much, much later, as a grown-up, I ran into someone else called Collingwood. He's the last of the great idealists in the British tradition. After that, Britain will know only analytic philosophy. He wrote an essay on philosophical method. There, he approved the proof for the existence of God, which I haven't shown you yet. But he says, yes, this is a good way of proving that God exists. His contemporary, Gilbert Ryle, immediately after he will pick up the same chair at the same university in Oxford, he will be the professor of metaphysics, writes a review of his book and says, you must be an idiot. Mr. Collingwood, the ontological argument is so wrong, so obviously wrong. Well, the thing is that it was published in Mind. It went on. And as a young postdoc in Oxford, I discovered something not particularly sort of interesting to discover, and virtually everybody knew that it was there. But rumbling inside the Bodleian Library, I discovered this manuscript, 3 letters between Mr. Collingwood and Mr. Reale, in which, in a way, highly civilized, they exchanged comments on the ontological proof. In these 3 letters, Collingwood replies to the review, Reale replies to the letter, he replies to the reply. They are there because Collingwood decided that anything could be consulted of his own legacy, but cannot be published. I checked with the daughter of Collingwood's, and she said, sorry, my dad, legacy stands. You can't publish this. But you can always write an article on it. So in 1994, I wrote this little article, with which I will not bother you. It exactly, on the debate between Collingwood and Reale on the ontological argument. So it's been a while since I've been scratching this particular itch. Does God exist? Now, on this point, there are only 2 good philosophy in the whole history of Western philosophy. Only 2. There is the philosophy that deals and struggles with the problem of the existence of God, and then there is the philosophy that deals and struggles with the existence of God. Any other philosophy, don't even bother to read it. It is not serious enough. Because if you haven't realized that, depending on the answer to that question, most of your philosophy will change color one way or another, you're not good enough to do philosophy. You should be doing something else. So at this point, what's the argument? Now, this is the terrifying moment when I hope that YouTube that I recommended to check, in case you have the headphones and so on, this is a good moment. Because now we start doing a little bit of hard work. This is a way, and pretty standard, standard as in encyclopedia level way of reconstructing Leibniz's version of the ontological argument. I won't bother you too much with the details, but if you scan through, there's one particular point that I want to call your attention to, and I will comment on this slowly and painfully for the next 20 minutes on every sentence. The whole point is about thinking an object. Think of 10 euros in your pocket, assuming you don't have 10 euros in your pocket. Now you think of the best way of conceiving 10 euros. The texture, the value, the color, the description, the sensible touch. Add all the possible properties to those 10 euros, and you got that? Have you got that in your mind? Well, that's it. It doesn't mean that it becomes a 10 euro in your pocket, which is pretty much what Kant was saying in reply to the argument. You can think about something very, very intensely, very powerfully. It doesn't transform that thought into a reality. Otherwise, I would have met my wife much earlier. If that is the case, then how come that you can think about God, and if you think really carefully and understand what you mean, boom, it's there. That sounds like the rabbit from the hat, but not quite. What's the difference between the 10 pounds, the 10 euros, the whatever currency Kant was using, the thalers and so on, and God? God is the special entity. Contrary to this little bottle here, what this argument shows you in detail, as I tell you in a moment, is that if this entity, this special entity exists, it doesn't exist accidentally. It's not like you and me. It's not a 10 euros. If something like this exists necessarily. And this is all that matters at this stage, is the necessary existence of this entity. Now, stay with me. Forget about the 10 euros, because no matter how much you think about them, they will not come to your pocket anyway, so you can give up that mental experiments and start thinking about God. So God, what kind of thing am I thinking about? This kind of thing. I'm thinking about God as something that has all the perfections. The Latin there comes from ansum, remember, almost 1,000 years ago. It's something that is so big, so perfect, so baba-boom, that you can't think anything else more baba-boom than God. It's the ultimate bazinga, okay? Now, if God is the ultimate bazinga, well, surely, as part of being the vava-boom ultimate bazinga, it's to exist. Because otherwise, I could think of, as it were, a God plus that is not only bazinga, but is bazinga and it exists. That's cooler than, remember the 10 euros you were thinking about? Well, what's the difference between 10 euros in your mind and 10 euros in my pocket? Well, actually, that's a big difference. Those are much better than mine because those exist. Oh, that's the same to God then. No, if you think about God as I said, the ultimate whatever, well, the ultimate whatever plus existence, it's a little bit better. So think about all this perfection put together. Okay, so far so good. I hope that you start getting the magician here. Okay, ready? Well, here is the hat. And the hat says, think about this rabbit called God, and his existence is more powerful, more than anything you ever thought about. Surely, if you can think of something more, you better have that thought. Keep going. Okay, well, so far so good. So this is the ultimate sort of recipe for all perfections I've ever seen, I've ever conceived in the world. But what the heck is a perfection? Oh, number two. Wait. Easy. A perfection is simple and an absolute property. This is what Leibniz contributes to the argument. Well, really, a perfection. Well, that's problematic. It's, first of all, controversial whether a perfection. Imagine the most perfect dress for a party. Is that simple and absolute? In what way is simple and absolute? I mean, I've seen things in my house that, they might be perfect, but certainly not simple. But this is also something we come back to when we understand number 6. So keep this in mind, because Leibniz will try to convince you, Leibniz the magician, that perfection is this simple and absolute. Okay, well, let's concede number 2. So we go somewhere. And at this point, you have to be friendly towards the magician. The magician wants to entertain you. So don't be so skeptical. Come with me. Now let's see how the rabbit comes out of the hat. Existence is a perfection. Well, remember the 10 euros in your mind and the ones in my pocket? Surely they seem to be a little bit better than the ones in your mind. But I'm sure you must have had conversation with someone who said, oh, there is too perfect to be real. Sorry? You mean perfection actually is in contrast with existence? If something is so perfect, so beautiful, so intensely bazinga, that it cannot exist. You see, that's why it's also controversial. In fact, actually, from Kant onwards, remember when I was a little kid and I said, I like Anselm, I like Kant, and I want them to be friends. I said, no, sorry, Luciano, they can't be friends. One or the other. Well, Kant says, sorry, existence is not a property. It's not something that you, as you were, stretch. Oh, that sort of, this bottle is a better bottle than that bottle because it contains more water. It doesn't leak. It's, no, sustainable, etc. It doesn't work that way. Existence is an extra. I think Kant was wrong on this. Imagine the best description of your iPhone. Perfect. The one that describes your iPhone, which I can see someone of you is particularly intently talking about in front of me right now, despite what I'm saying right now. Thank you. Despite your iPhone being so attractive, imagine this conception of iPhone, and at the same time, imagine someone says, oh, all the definition of the iPhone, that's what I'm talking about. Existence, and it exists. It doesn't add anything. Well, does it not? Imagine I tell you, and by the way, it's broken. Well, that makes a difference. It doesn't define your iPhone. So imagine a triangle, with 3 sides and over the rest, and it says, oh, and it also exists. Well, that's nice, that's an extra. So someone recently, well, a few decades ago said, oh, imagine the best prime minister, not my own invention, no Brexit reference whatsoever, is a real example. Malcolm, American philosopher, imagine the best minister, and it says, this is a whole description, and that's it. No, I'd like to know whether that exists or not. So Kant, I think he was a bit dodgy on this, but more on this if you like to talk about it. But at the moment, we need to describe this as a historical property. There are historical properties that belong to your iPhone. For example, the iPhone here's the perfect concept of an iPhone, and it's scratch. What is this? It's historical. It's something that has happened to your iPhone. It doesn't define your iPhone, but it makes a difference. So some properties are actually a bit more historical. So let's translate for a moment so that I bypass Kant. Remember, I want the 2 friends. I say, okay, forget about existence. I'm going to call not existence, but presence. There's a difference between being present and being full stop. You exist, but you may not be present here. You're probably thinking about something else, or I hope so for you. So you might be present elsewhere with your friends and whatever happens this evening. But imagine being present as being located in a possible world. Imagine talking about a table, and where is the table? Or is present in that room as opposed to that room? What happens? Oh, we can build this. More magician tricks. A married bachelor. Where do you find a married bachelor? For those of you who don't know the word bachelor, is scapolo. Uno scapolo sposato. Scapolo sposato, the married bachelor, does not exist. It does not exist, not here, not there, anywhere. You can't find it anywhere. So we have a terminology for this, introduced by Leibniz. No matter what possible world you're going to investigate, which room you're going to check, there is no married bachelor there. There is no square triangle. There is no something that is and isn't at the same time scratch and no scratch. In other words, contradictory entities do not exist. Oh, that's a nice trick. This is the magician apprentice. If you are convinced that you can prove the non-existence of something by simply looking at the concept of that something, you just did something magic. You proved that something does not exist, never checking whether in the world there is or there isn't that particular object. Well, of course I know. I mean, it's a married bachelor. I don't have to check every room in the building to know that there isn't a married bachelor there, obviously. Well, this is as far as the ontological negative proof goes, and everybody should agree on this. So at least this much we have gained. Step number one. This is not magic. You can prove the non-existence of contradictory objects all over the world. Fantastic. It doesn't buy you much, but it's better than nothing. What about unicorns? Well, a unicorn doesn't exist here, but it could have existed. I mean, at the end of the day, we got stranger animals around than unicorns. So there is a possible world in which, the Earth goes, instead of there, it goes there, and evolution produced unicorns. So we say that unicorns do not exist, but they do not exist in a way very different from the way in which a married bachelor doesn't exist. I hope this is clear, because if you buy this, you're already halfway through being happy with the ontological proof. So there are plenty of possible alternatives in which none of us here exist. Your mom, your dad, my mom, my dad never met. I know it's unpleasant, especially given how my parents tell me they met by accident, totally. My dad was wearing the wrong clothes at the wrong party. He was the only one wearing black tie. My mom took him for a waitress. He thought he was the only opportunity he ever had, to get out with that sort of beautiful individual. I'm here because my dad that night decided to wear black tie. There are plenty of possible worlds in which that doesn't happen. So I could easily be a unicorn, and so you are. But what about the moon? So the moon exists, but there are plenty ones in which it doesn't exist, like you and I. So we're moving all the way up to the number of possible worlds, or situations, if you like, in which something exists. And if something exists, no matter which situation you check, that is called necessary existence. Something that exists always, everywhere, anytime, in any possible sense. So if this is clear, then if existence is part of the essence of their entity, well, their entity exists necessarily, is part of what their entity is. And that's what we speak about when you speak about God. So what's the number of possible worlds in which married bachelor occurs or are present? This many. That's it? None. But how many worlds are there in which unicorns exist? An infinite number. It doesn't mean that there are no possible worlds in which they do not exist, because here's one. But there's an infinite number of possible worlds in which, of course, unicorns exist, happily. And how many possible worlds are there in which the moon occurs or doesn't occur? Again, infinite. But when it comes to something that exists everywhere, in every possible world, I know you know what the next slide is going to look like. It looks like this. Everywhere. Anytime. All possible worlds. Or consider that a possible world is a world in which everything is identical here, but this bottle is not here, it's here. That's a possible world, different from the present one. And this is another possible world. So there's a lot of possible worlds. Quite a number. In fact, no, we go to the transfinite that you saw discussed before. So we are in good company. I think we have understood that if God exists necessarily, remember the blue picture, well, it exists everywhere. If it doesn't exist, it does not exist anywhere. I think this is the biggest, most important contribution that Leibniz ever gave us in terms of analysis of the ontological proof. He made a big step forward, which is, look at this. No matter what you think about God, don't be such a fool. Don't think that God exists or does not exist contingently as it happens. Another way of putting this, which is a bit less sort of serious, is if God doesn't shave, he never, ever shave. Never. Because God can't change. It's not like me that, no, I grow old. So if that entity, remember, the thing that you thought was the most perfect of all perfections is out there, either is there or it's impossible. So the answer to the question of this talk is no. But not in the intuitive way of no. God is not possible in the sense that either it's impossible in the sense in which a married bachelor is impossible. You're talking nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's like talking about the biggest of all natural numbers. Nonsense. It looks like you're making sense, but there isn't. Or it's not possible in the sense that it's so possible that it's actually necessary. So it's not possible, it's much more than possible. So whichever way you look at the question, it's not that God is possible as in contingently here, not contingently there. No, it's either always there or never there. And I think that's another bigger progress. Okay, well, I'm getting somewhere here. We at least see, as it were, the ears of the rabbit coming out of the hat. So we got two things now. We can prove the non-existence of things if they are contradictory. Okay, that's cool. Remember, a poetic approach to language. We're building things with language here. And two, we understood one fundamental thing, that God either does not exist at all, is an impossibility. It's not like a unicorn, okay? Anyone who tells you, oh, I don't believe in God, why? I find it unlikely. No, unlikely. Really? You did not understand what you're talking about. As Anselm said, the fool did not understand what he was talking about. It's not that God is unlikely, and therefore you have no, you toss the coins. So let's move on, because we have work to do here. So if it is possible for a necessary being to exist, then a necessary being does exist, which is what I said in the past 5 minutes, basically. But is it? Remember the question, now we have these two alternatives. Either God is like the blue screen, is everywhere, or is like the white screen, is nowhere. There is no mix and match. Okay? As simple as that. How do we know which screen is the right one? The white or the blue? Remember what I said at the very beginning? So, you only need to check. You're talking about this entity. You say is, no, the Bazinga, remember, all perfections all put together. That's why their existence is either white, as it were, or blue, everywhere, nowhere. Surely, all you need to do is inspect the nature of the object. Look at what it's made of. Well, my dear Leibniz, it's not that simple. If you remember that particular perfect dress for that party was neither simple nor absolute. So perfection here is an immensely charged word which leaves us with a lot of doubts. I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. It looks like perfection is simple and absolute to you. It looks complex and ununderstandable to me. I'm afraid number two is not a move that can convince someone who is not already convinced. As it were, the magician plays with a gullible group of people, and you have to concede something to the magician. And here, we need to concede to Leibniz, the magician, that too is okay. Of course, not perfection, simple, absolute, fine, let's go ahead. And that's why number 6 becomes reasonable. It is possible for a being to have all perfections. But remember, a moment ago I said, well, let's think about the biggest of all natural numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, bigger. A million, bigger, more. There is no more here. And you can always go +1. So you can always say, look, anyone who has that conception of, oh yeah, I perfectly understand what you're talking about. I'm talking about the biggest of all natural numbers, is fooling her or himself. No, you don't. You just have very confused ideas what a natural number is. So maybe what we have is a very confused idea about what it means to put all these ingredients in the world, perfection in terms of goodness, perfection in terms of knowledge, perfection in terms of all properties that belong to us? Is that God looked like us? I thought it was the other way around. You start getting really sort of in trouble. So I'm not quite sure whether we can concede 2 and 6 to Leibniz. But if we do, well, the rest follows quite nicely. Therefore, a necessary being does exist. Oh, good. So how are we playing this? So now you have a sense, I hope sufficiently clear, we spent about half an hour on this, of what it means to have the ontological proof there. Remember, language, like a lawyer, and a good lawyer, Leibniz builds something with language. After all, that's what we do when decide about creating a particular law or a particular argument. Now, has that been convincing? Well, we have basically 2 teams here, the pro and the contra. On Leibniz's side, Anselm, of course, who actually devised the argument in the first place, Descartes, believe it or not, he was a full, stronger supporter of the ontological argument. And then some major players here, Hegel, Gödel. Now, these are not imbeciles. These are not idiots. I'll say, okay, fine, so there must be something into it. I'm quoting basically Collingwood. There is something into it. But unfortunately, the party against, the one that says, remember 2 and 6, I'm not convinced here, there is something dodgy about it, is Gaunilo, who was the first, all we know about him is that he wrote a criticism of Anselm and used exactly the 10 euros in your pocket analysis. He didn't have the 10 euros, he had the perfect island, but didn't make any difference. He said, well, imagine the most perfect islands of all kinds, with a perfect, I don't know, Palm Beach, and it still doesn't exist necessarily, it's just there, it's in your mind, so how come that all of a sudden the island pops into existence? He hadn't quite understood the mechanism, but he had a point. But then the other ones, they are disturbing, because it's Cassandre against Descartes, Kant, Russell. I mean, these are also not fools, not idiots. There is, at the end, a bit of a discrimination here between those who think about the world as being a matter of existence coming in degrees. Remember when we discussed the married bachelor, white screen, unicorn. Not in this possible world, but there is another one in which, no, there is a unicorn, fine. Moon, in this possible world, but I can imagine not existing, and God, blue screen. Well, that is just another way of talking in medieval terms. It tells you that existence comes in degrees, and you can exist more and more and more. Well, from Kant onwards, we don't think that way. We think that something either is or isn't. Well, who is right and who is wrong here? I'm not quite sure. But if you think in terms of a digital culture, we are moving towards is or isn't. Whereas if you think in terms of an analog culture, well, this more and more becomes interesting. And then there's an epistemological divide. This is crucial, and we don't have time today, but it means that for some philosophers, especially medieval ones, but not only them, if you conceive something in your mind, that is a form of existence. Only some of you will grasp the point I'm going to make, I'm afraid. This means that if you think of something carefully enough, that entity already has a possible existence, but then everything else remains simply possible unless there is the Bazinga entity, and if it is the Bazinga entity, that blues the whole screen all of a sudden. In other words, imagine the screen white and God being a pixel. If you allow one blue pixel on that white screen, he will cover the whole bloody screen. He cannot stop. It's like a virus. That existence will cover every possible world you can possibly imagine. The one that makes the difference between this possible world and that possible world. So either you do not allow one pixel to become blue, or everything is blue. Okay? So here's the divide. If you have that thought of God in your mind and you think, I have this, I really have it. It's a pixel in the white screen. Blue. I hope this goes somewhere towards understanding what we're talking about here. But if you find it difficult, remember, people have been discussing this for centuries. It's complicated. There is a final twist that I hope will keep you awake for another 5 minutes. Give me another 5 minutes and I'll take questions. So the outcome is quite clear. The theist, the one who believes in the existence of God, believes or is happy to accept some of the reasonable assumptions behind the argument in favor of the existence of God. He buys, as it were, some of the metaphysical, epistemological requirements that make that reasonable. The atheist does not. Okay, great deal. And where am I standing here? Because I kind of find it a little bit on the one hand, on the other hand, and I'm not quite sure. Well, that is the agnostic. Now, the agnostic has a difficult task. Don't give me the agnostic as the unicorn agnostic, right? I mean, that much should be clear after today. If you do not believe in the existence of God, you do not believe in the existence of God in a way different from not believing in the existence of unicorns. These are two different ways of handling the world. It's not like, oh, I don't believe in the existence of God in the same way as I don't believe in Zorro, okay? Or, I don't know, Peter Pan. So what can, and that's the final, coming to the conclusion, what can the agnostic do with the open question? So, is the argument okay or not okay? At the end of the day, what's the answer, Professor, for the question for the exam? Huh? I don't care about all the reasoning. Is that yes or no? Well, you can always shift. And the shift comes from a different guy, completely different, which I want to use with you for the first time. This is a bit of research, recent. The guy in question didn't have a PhD, but he was called Saint, so, which I think is higher than having a PhD. So sometimes I call him San Paul, because I think that gives him a certain kind of status. So Paul of Tarsus, he writes in this beautiful Corinthians first letter, chapter 13. Someone joked that the Corinthians never replied, the bastards. It's true. I mean, I don't think that we have the replies from the Corinthians to any of the letters sent. But poor Paul was sending letters, and it's the same place which you must have heard about whenever you attended one wedding. Love is not this, love is not that. Remember? That's the same passage. Much later, he says, dear friends, and now abideth faith, hope, charity. These three. But the greatest of this is charity. Now, two comments here. One, this is beautiful engineering. This is remarkable, beautiful engineering. Think of this. You got three resources to get from A to B, and by the time you get to B, two of the resources can be discharged. The A is this earth. If you could keep quiet, it would be much helpful. Thank you. You don't have to be interested, but quiet, yes. If you move from this earth to paradise, well, two of the three are useless. Now, once you're in paradise, you don't have to have faith, and you don't have to have hope. You still have charity, as in agape. But what about hope? Well, hope is, as we say among logicians, is a propositional attitude. You hope that such and such is the case. You hope that this is going to end sooner or later. I can't bear this guy talking anymore. I hope to go home. I hope that this not happen again, etc. So you have hope, that proposition. If that's the case, then if you hope that married bachelors exist, then you are a fool. You are really irrational, because you know that they don't, and they cannot. If you hope that in this possible world unicorns exist, then you're also a fool, because you know that they do not and cannot. You can hope that a lab around the corner will bioengineer a unicorn. Well, that is a reasonable hope, because it's a possibility. What about that long sentence we started with? God existing as a being having all perfections. Well, remember, we were stuck with the white screen and the blue screen, and we didn't quite know which way to go. But that means that I could hope that the blue screen is the right screen. Any reference to matrix and pills, utterly accidental. I can hope that God exists, even if I should be foolish, at least for this analysis, to believe that God exists. Which means that, to conclude, we should really move from a theology of faith, A believes that God as the being having all perfections exist, to a theology of hope. A hopes that God exists as such and such. The next question, of course, is do we have a duty to hope? Is that something that we should impose on ourselves, to hope that there is a God such and such. But as they say, in every better season, that's the end of season 1, and you will have to wait for season 2 to get an answer to that one. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have some time for questions, in case anyone is still alive.
Yes, we have definitely, we hope to have time. We do have time. We have time for questions, and please, I saw many people on that side that were really extremely attentive. Does any of you want to intervene? I mean, would you like to ask a question or say something? I would like to ask a question while we are waiting for anybody else to come up. I mean, what was Leibniz's position on religion in terms of him personally? What did he think?
So Leibniz thought, at least to my best understanding, that he
was Christian, and he was also, I read that he was religious, he was Lutheran, right? So
Leibniz develops the argument that I presented to you today in reaction to what he reads in Descartes. This is really friendly fire. So basically, these are two guys on the same side, as usual, classic, killing each other because they are on the same side, but not quite exactly the same side. So they're both on the side of, yes, this argument works. They're both, according to the argument and their profession, Christians. And yet they still disagree on exactly how it works. It's like, pick up two magicians, and one wants to have the white rabbit and then wants to have the brown rabbit. So in the case of Leibniz, he thought that Descartes had made a mistake in his argument. In the fifth meditation, Descartes presents, and especially in the replies to Gassendi and so on, presents the argument in a different way. And Leibniz says, no, that's not the right way of doing it. Let me fix it. And he fixes, as we have seen here. But they're both on the same side. They're both Christians. They both believe that the ontological argument works. And whether they were Christians and therefore believed the ontological argument, or they found the logical argument convincing and therefore they maintained their Christianity, I think that is just chicken and egg that we don't have to get into. Because at the end, you want to have both. So the chicken and the egg. But yes, we're on the same side. Both Christians, both convinced that the ontological proof was final. Proof as in 2 + 2 = 4, not as in maybe, like convincing. No, final, definite answer to the question. Move over, because this is solved. That was the approach.
I would like to know also, what is your view?
Sorry?
Your personal view.
My personal view is about hope. Because as an agnostic, I can't make up my mind between the blue and the white screen. I just cannot understand how or to my own satisfaction, you might be able to do this, but I not. I can't conceive the best of all possible bazinga vavavoom without having the doubt somewhere here that I'm making a fool of myself, that I'm not quite getting, it's a classic kid, like, I want to have the biggest object in the world, and then you make it a little bit bigger and bigger. And so I don't understand what it means, really, deeply, profoundly, as in sort of leaving by, and therefore I'm stuck with the blue and the white screen. But I found this a way around, thinking, okay, I can still hope, and that would be rational. Hoping that it's a blue screen, and hoping that God exists, is not stupid, and it's not anti-empirical or anything else. It leaves a tiny little fraction of light that gets into the things. I find that convincing so far. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to ask Professor Floridi a question? Selmer. If Selmer could get the microphone here. Hopefully this works. Is that again? Okay, then the other one.
How about this?
Sorry.
Yes. Oh, no matter. Hello? Oh, it's a miracle. Empirical evidence for it's trumping your ontological. No, thank you very much for really, that was a marvelous, I thought anyway, marvelous talk. And I confess, I've never thought about hope as a propositional attitude, but I guess you're right. And I don't know how to make sense of it and how to model it at this point. So I'm not sure I can do anything else for the rest of the day other than try to figure that out. I'm shocked. I never thought of that. I don't know what it is, but you're a hopeful person apparently. Okay. So first, I thought you were very conservative in your pro list.
Oh, yeah.
And you know that, right? So you put Gödel up there, and that's great. But it's Plantinga, it's Norman Malcolm, it's Whitehead on his better days, it's Ed Zalta currently at Stanford. I mean, this is a long list, and I think that part of the service that you just did was making it clear to people that, as you said, on both sides, these are not imbeciles. Unfortunately, it's complicated, as you also said. Now, my question is, wouldn't it have been better, and isn't it perhaps better now, to speak not of perfection and perfections in the abstract, but to begin by noting that we're really not talking about inanimate objects. We're not wondering about whether there's an electron of a certain location or even a mathematical object of a certain type. We're talking about creatures, right? Beings or something like that. I mean, maybe you mix the categories and there's no harm there, but moon, inanimate object, relatively large from our vantage point, versus unicorn, which is a creature and an animal. So let me ask you, would it make the argument more perspicuous if we looked at the category, the categories in the plural actually, of what makes for a perfect creature or being? Okay, because presumably, and some people might object to this, but you're more cognitively powerful than not a unicorn. Perhaps you would in fiction, but a horse, right? So if we looked at it in terms of what you know, what your reasoning is, then we looked at your ethical dimension, etc. Does that make any difference, and has that made any difference I don't know the history of the argument, because certainly you didn't do that. You used Leibniz's version, which doesn't do that. But that was my first puzzlement when I saw Descartes' version, and then later Leibniz's proposed improvement. Why are they talking about perfections in the abstract? We're really just talking about beings or creatures. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe I hope that makes some sense.
No, it makes sense. The answer is a cautious, not quite sure. It does make a difference. Remember that what you need, not Selm knows. I mean, remember you that might not have seen this before. What you need is to talk about X, whatever X is at the moment. But you need an engine, something that cracks from X being possible, just like something that could happen, could be, to something that exists necessarily. And that cracking up is done by something like being better than, more perfect than. But the vocabulary can change. And remember, we're using language to create stuff. So what language you use makes a huge difference. In that sense, yes. Language, not just English or Chinese. Language as in your conceptual tools whereby you build the concept you're dealing with. So we're doing here what I like in other contexts to talk in terms of conceptual design. You're using the most powerful thing that humanity has ever developed, namely our conceptual ideas and languages, logic, mathematics, and so on, the languages that we have developed, in order to create entities and make sure that we understand them and we see what's in them. Now, whether this might be improved and clarified by a better language, probably. Whether it would sort of resolve the dispute between the two parties, the pro and the contra, I'm not quite sure. I doubt it. I think that what would happen is that whatever language we're going to use, think in terms of a programming language, for example. It affords certain kind of things, become more easy, other things are more difficult. You choose it depending on the goal that you want to reach. Now, if that sort of language that creates the entities you're dealing with is a language that allows you to have that cranking up mechanism, in other words, moving from possible to necessary, then you're home and safe and dry, as we say back. And being safe and dry in England is almost a miracle. But apart from that, any other language I think would do. Now that's why they have to introduce something like being better than, the thing that you can't think anything bigger than, more perfect than, because without that sort of gear, you never move from possible to just possible. You never move from your 10 euros in the pocket to in the bank. And in fact, God is, and I also think everybody should agree on this, is the entity and the only entity for which that cranking up works. Nothing else does. Or to put it more philosophically, for those of you who actually do sort of this stuff, for any other entity for which that cranking up works, he would be or she would be God. So basically there's an overlap between the extension of entities that can be subject to that process and this particular entity. But we're getting really late and a bit too technical here, so I don't want to bother you even further than I have so far. But the answer is yes, clarification, probably not in terms of dispute. No. Everybody agnostic from now on?
Yes, Giovanni Sartori.
One thing that I would like to... So you said it is possible to doubt about the existence of God, that is what you are saying, but the existence of the God cannot be considered to be contingent. Is this true?
Not the first, yes, the second. God cannot exist contingent. I mean, if you understand what you're talking about, you understand that God cannot happen to exist a day yes, another day no, in this world, but not in another. It's not like you and me. It's not like a chair. It's not something that contingently happens or not happens to be. Either is, and that's the end of the story, or isn't, and that's the end of the story. But it's not happens to be. You can't think in terms of, oh, I live in a universe where there is no God, but there's another universe in which God exists. Now, that is, like 5-year-old childish talk. I don't think that is a disputable point. I think Sam and I on this probably agree. I hope. Now, either God exists necessarily or he does not exist necessarily. But he cannot exist or not exist contingently, as it happens. That's the point, yeah.
So just to finish on that, so let us assume that I have the standard the catechism view of God as a being which is good and omniscient and omnipotent, something like that. Such a being can still be contingent or not? You need to construct it in your way in order to be necessary or not?
No, I think that we're back to same point. In other words, we're misusing language. We're just being in a linguistic trap. No, it isn't. Language is a means to deal with those things called concepts, but we don't get stuck with the language. Language is a means towards. Yes, we would be caught in a contingent way of describing God, but that doesn't matter. No. What matters is that the entity we will be dealing with will still be either necessarily existing or necessarily non-existing, but we would not make any sense by describing it as contingently here or there, sometimes yes, sometimes no, depending on the culture, depending on... No. That doesn't go well. No, the universe developed in such a way that God exists. It makes no sense. Then you are what Anselm thought, the fool who denies the existence of God. You really, not you, I mean, one is a fool. Not quite getting the point. But doubt, yes, doubt, but the doubt that I hope I explain, the doubt is not about, how likely is it that there's a God in this universe? No. The doubt is God, when I speak about God, like talking about the biggest of natural numbers, married bachelors, or I'm talking about the greatest thing ever, and that's makes a lot of sense. That is the doubt. Remember the two screens, white or blue? Is it something that nowhere to be found or everywhere to be found? The fact that it's in some bits of the screen, that is irrational. But it's not irrational to be an atheist. Don't get me wrong. You can be an atheist by having a full belief in the impossibility, logical impossibility of God equal to square triangles. You say, oh, I believe in God. Oh, you believe in square triangles. That's the atheist position. That's what the atheist should be saying. The atheist who has doubts about the existence of God, he is a moron. He doesn't quite understand what he's thinking.
Thank you for this talk. It's inspiring and very well done. So thank you. Now my question. And you are waiting my question.
Microphone.
You are waiting something, right?
Well, you said you were going to ask a question.
I only said.
Yeah.
I only said something.
Maybe
Do you believe it?
We might mean to. We have to move to the next
Perhaps I
question.
will ask a question. Perhaps I don't. So, what is the difference between speaking and doing in these questions? Because this is my problem when I am doing history or sociology. What about the constraints? This is a big, big question. God is a big, big question. Anna, I was actually waiting for it. Anna asked you an ad hominem question. What do you believe? Because this is exactly what everybody would ask you. But imagine that Anna was charming in our chair. Is not that charming in our chair. Is your queen. What would you tell her? I am an agnostic. Are you sure? So sometimes when you do history, because you do history as well, you have to be strategic and taking into account the constraints of the questions. And this is a big, big question.
Sure.
You know? So I would like you to talk about it, because I'm sure that
No,
you have something.
this is as I said, I couldn't put it more strongly. This is the question. Philosophy really is divided between the philosophy that takes this question seriously, whichever way you go, and the philosophy that doesn't ask the question about God. If the philosophy that doesn't ask the question of God is not worth studying. Of course, it doesn't have to be today or tomorrow, but sooner or later, if you have a philosophical view, surely you must have wondered, what's the place of God in this picture? And if you haven't, well, there's work to be done. Because it's not just a matter of writing a little piece of conceptual clarification in a corner of some Indo-European confusion about indexicals, which is what we do on a regular basis, by the way, in academia. So good philosophy is always eschatological, is a discourse about the end of things. And if you have a philosophy that discusses the end of things, inevitably, sooner or later, God starts playing a role. So, in terms of constraints, by all means, but I will say, in terms of the question asked and the value of what I'm saying here, a confession might be in place. There are philosophers who philosophize and philosophers who leave their philosophy. I belong to the second kind. So, if I'm agnostic, it's because I've done this. Don't think for a moment that I'm agnostic and then I did this. So there's a difference between the academic philosophy, which I invite you to disregard every time, and philosophy as what you live through, what guides at least some of you who are not chit-chatting at the moment, disturbing what I'm saying right now. Now, those of you who have paid any attention, and it's been a long day, will have had at some point, and will have in the future, moments of philosophical reflection. They don't come regularly, and it's an acquired taste, but it's a good thing. And therefore, to the question, what do you think? I think what I just showed you. There is no difference between what I think and what I present.
You are living by philosophy, and that's very good. But this is perhaps you are going to the end. But philosophy, in this sense, this is the beginning of conflicts as well, because of course you can be killed for that. So
I think we're running out of time. I'm really curious to know what those guys are talking about over there. Is there anything you want to share with us that's interesting, that has to do with the subject, or not at all? Because there was just a lot of going on throughout this whole discussion, so I'm curious. Maybe, if you're discussing about God, please let us in on your thoughts.
I'm sorry, I know we're running out of time, but there's something that I'm missing. If God either exists or doesn't exist, how is it possible he's connected to our world without becoming something contingent? This is the part I'm missing of the speech.
That's one of the best questions. I wish I had a decent answer. But remember, let me get away with this analogy, because I don't have an answer. That is one of the questions, trust me, it really is. But imagine the following scenario. So pick up the blue screen again, and that blue screen is made by blue pixels. Every blue pixel is a possible world. Of all those blue pixels, one is this world, this one, the one in which we live, the one that became actual, that not only is possible, but actually is very possible to the point of existing. Well, remember, the blue is everywhere. So when we say that God is everywhere, we say not only that he's here, but he's everywhere, including in every possible world. Now, a different analogy when we talk about omnipresence is the following. How can I be everywhere? It doesn't make any sense. Well, imagine the following scenario. You are in this room, and therefore you are in this building. This building is in Turin, therefore you are in Turin. Turin is in Piedmont, therefore you get a little gist. So you are everywhere. Well, in that logic, I am everywhere within that possible world. Now, God has the special sort of status of having in this room, in Turin, in Piedmont, in Italy, etc., 360 degrees. Is the blue all over the screen? So how God connects as a necessary being to a contingent world is somehow misleading, because there is no possible world to which God is not connected, since every possible world is where God exists. That would be the explanation. Do I believe what I just said? I'm not quite sure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. There's a 5-minute break, and then there's going to be music and a nice presentation.